Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to those of you who have logged in from the UK. Good afternoon to those of us in China, and welcome to this CBBC webinar on integrity due diligence, identifying risk issues when investing in new business relationships in China. My name is Simon Stewart. I'm a Director for Business Advisory here at CBBC in Shanghai. By means of introduction, I just want to do three things. The three things that I want to do is just to introduce how CBBC webinars work to the people joining us across the UK and China, a very brief introduction to CBBC, and then finally into the introduction of the topic and speaker for today. CBBC webinars, in fact, are designed to give insights from experts in China to deliver information from here in China to those of us around the world. But also, it's an opportunity for you to ask questions. So what you'll see is a panel in your top right-hand corner, which gives an opportunity for you to type in a particular question. So I definitely encourage you to ask questions throughout the course of the webinar, and we'll either pick it up during the course of the presentation, or we'll keep it to the Q&A at the end. But the webinars are there for you, so please do feel free to put a question in the box, and we'll take it either throughout the course of the presentation or at the end. Very, very quickly about CBBC. China-Britain Business Council has been working with China for over 60 years. Through our member network, we help companies navigate through the China market, the complexities of the China market, the ambiguities of the China market. We help companies really understand how to work here. Through our research services, we work directly with UK firms to assess opportunities and risk and find partners. Find the types of partners who are right for you to do business with here. And we basically help UK companies make better decisions. So it seems very appropriate that today we'll be talking about integrity due diligence, because the bigger the deal, the bigger the risk. And it gets to a stage with international companies where they need to understand in a lot more depth the business environment in China, but critically, the partners that they're working with. And so when they are able to conduct high-quality integrity due diligence, they'll be able to protect the interests of the international firm that is operating in China, but also move forward with your eyes open, and to make quality decisions in terms of the partners that you work with and in terms of the way that you do business here in China. I'm delighted to be joined here by Mr. Tim Clarté. He's a partner at the Forensic Advisory Services practice at Grant Thornton. Tim's been working with China for over 20 years and has conducted over 200 due diligence and corporate intelligence reports across multiple sectors, across different sectors, and also crucially in different areas of China. So without any further hesitation, I'd like to hand the floor over to Tim to give an introduction to what he does at Grant Thornton on integrity due diligence. Tim.
Very good. Thank you very much, Simon, and thanks to CBBC for the opportunity to share a few thoughts on integrity due diligence when your organization is considering investments in China. In today's discussion, I'd like to cover a few key points. It's focusing mainly on things such as the value and the importance of integrity due diligence. We feel that understanding the value of conducting an IDD search and why it's a vital part of the overall due diligence process is critical to understand and get right from the start. In this section, we'll talk about fraud in the news and IDD as a solution to complex reputational risks in the market. In the next section, we'll explain what happens in the conduct of commonly used integrity due diligence procedures. We'll look at backgrounds, activities, reputations, and provide an in-depth insight into target companies and individuals. We'll actually talk about what happens when an IDD check takes place. Next, we'll explain what risks these procedures are aimed at discovering, addressing any corruption or other reputational issues before committing to a new business relationship, as Simon said, and also appreciating the importance of addressing potential risks to your investment decisions to safeguard your investment. In the final section, I'll talk a little bit about some case studies, and we'll look at how achieving IDD objectives can avert liability and reputational damage. I've got 3 case studies today based on the time that we have allowed to focus on how integrity due diligence can and has averted negative outcomes by disclosing risk before a transaction was executed. We present a few real-world examples of IDD, what was revealed, and how it influenced the foreign business partner's decisions. So without further ado, I'll begin. When one thinks about integrity, these are some of the associated words that comes to mind. Obviously, the character of the individual is important to know, understanding how and what their decisions are based on. It's very important to get right out front. Whether the person is honest and upright, observing their approach when facing decisions to test their honesty. Also morals. Appreciating the moral foundation or ethical compass of an individual or a company is also an important factor to understand him or her. Although many words can describe the integrity of someone, these descriptors do come to mind. So let me talk a little bit about the value and the importance of IDD. And I can't think of a better way to talk about this section without talking about what's in the news these days. These are just some articles that have been clipped out of the paper from years ago and also recently to share with you how important it is to know your business partner in China and some of the ramifications that could result without a proper integrity due diligence check. Nowadays, regulators and law enforcement agencies internationally are more aggressively investigating fraud. Chinese regulators are likewise acting more aggressively, especially against foreign companies, as we've seen. In the past, Chinese public officials were at risk if they were found to have received bribes. Payers of bribes were only subject to foreign government regulations, such as the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the UK anti-bribery law. However, as of 2013, the PRC criminal law has been amended to make payers of bribes also subject to prosecution and penalties. The rewritten regulations put offending foreign companies at a double jeopardy for attempting to bribe any public functionary because they are now at risk of being prosecuted in China as well as at home when the investigation is made public. A company that's contemplating an acquisition or a JV agreement needs to be aware of the risk posed by the particular acquisition target. Integrity due diligence, or IDD, combines methods used to examine targets and their principles to assess the risk they pose to the acquiring company, its brand, and of course, as we all know of those working in China, the reputation. This is a slide to highlight a few things that came into the news in late 2016. I think it was early to mid-December, with JP Morgan's investment bank in Hong Kong. They were under an investigation and have agreed to pay the DOJ and the U.S. government a penalty of $72 million to resolve the matter of the Sons and Daughters program. Essentially, what JP Morgan admitted to do is admit candidates hired during the period of time and give them titles or paid a very low amount as entry-level investment bankers. Now, despite the fact that many of these bankers performed we can say, non-contributable work to the bottom line, such as doing things like proofreading, providing real value to deliverable products, they were being hired very aggressively throughout China. You can see at the top right there that they stated, JP Morgan and Asia Pacific stated that $35 million in profits from business mandates with their Chinese counterparts were gained. But if you look a little bit more into the wording down below to the right, adding all the penalties together, it equated to about $265 million US. So although an admitted $35 million in profits was received over the course of this scheme, nearly $265 million was paid out. So this is something that is always in the news, and if you look at previous slides, there are some dates of 2009, 2010, but this one's as recent as December 2016. And in China, you'll see that there are actually other articles just by looking at the daily papers and media outlets. This is something that is occurring on quite a common basis. Now, this slide talks a little bit about the complexity of operating in China. I think everyone that's dialed into this webinar is very aware and acutely sensitive to how complex the operating environment is here in China. You need to understand when working with companies a little bit about their track record of operating here, how they did in past deals and how they manage past deals and if they have the experience to do so. The relations that they may have with the government is also critical to assess as early and as often as you can. Of course, the industry reputation, and then as much key information as possible to allow you to address and identify the risks early in the decision-making process. We feel that if you have this information in hand before the deal takes place or before the business partner is signed on, you're able to mitigate or reduce your risk to eliminate any post-closing surprises, to eliminate anything that could come back and be negative to your reputation in the market here in China. Now we have a clear picture or notion of what IDD is. Let's talk a little bit about what happens in the course of an IDD check. An IDD investigation typically begins with basic information about the subjects of the investigation, such as their names, their titles, their positions, job descriptions, along with any other information that can be provided by the client. The next step is to search public records, once you have the basic foundational information in hand. Search the public records for the subject's name or other personal details, using keywords based on other information that you may already have. These public record searches can uncover information about the subject's education, their job history, their associations. This phase of the research may also reveal involvement in public cases or with well-known politically exposed organizations. Occasionally, information revealed in the public record searches does call for human source inquiries by knowledgeable people in the industry or someone with knowledge of associations with whom the subject is involved. Sometimes persons with direct knowledge of the subject or their activities may be interviewed or discussed. Now, at all times, IDD professionals should be aware and knowledgeable of the environment of which their investigation is proceeding, knowing what of the research procedures are allowed under the local laws and what sources are most reliable. This is paramount. As you can see, this comes, the IDD research methodology comes from a combination of the public records, human source inquiries at times, and also industry knowledge or expertise. That's why partnering with an organization that has a global reach or has the capabilities within a specific industry is very beneficial to understanding who your business partner is and what their intentions may be. Next, we'll look specifically at what kinds of searches may be conducted and the sources that may be used. I've got a list up here of 12 boxes, and certainly I won't read through all 12 of them, but I think it's important for the audience to understand and have an appreciation for some of the objectives that are looked into when you're conducting an integrity due diligence check. These are the kind of searches conducted, as we say, to cut into the apple and look for some worms. If you look at the market reputation, obviously it's very important to understand if there are opinions held about the subject by others in the industry or by the subject's own company. It's important to get that information in hand as soon as possible to see where their reputation here is in China. Business affiliations, assets shared, understand the subject's business partners, understand their supplier relationships, very important as well to know up front. If they have stakes in public companies held by the subject, or as well as other assets, such as interest in real property in China or overseas. Court records, understanding their bankruptcy if they have a history of bankruptcy filings or their owned enterprises. All of this is public information that just needs to be collected, sensitized, and analyzed. And then you can also look at regulatory searches, as I mentioned, the criminal background, recorded investigations and sanctions by Chinese agencies for regulatory breaches. Clearly, information like this will not be publicly disclosed if you talk to them or your potential business partner. It's important to do a little public records research to understand where these objectives are coming from. And then beyond the borders of China, there may be international watch lists that should be scanned and reviewed to understand if they have any history or if they're marked within any international list. In the next slide, I'll talk about specific databases that are looked at. And then following the lines of overseas reports, activities, anything that to be done overseas that could be masked here domestically, it's important to have a very complete picture and understanding of what's going on in that respect. And then finally, in China, let's not overlook the importance of the family and political affiliations. This is something that is critical to understand, so it's a clear picture, who they know, and trying to understand the relationships and the maps between them. Next, I'll talk about some commonly checked databases. I know the print here is very small, but I think it's important just to give you an appreciation of how many public databases are out there that can give you detailed information about an individual. Should note that these are open source databases that are included in services like WorldCheck from Thomson Reuters, or other services that could be subscription-based or actually in the free public domain. Some of them are government agency databases. Some of them are coming from watch lists, as I said earlier, police departments, Interpol, Securities and Exchange Commission, and others that are related to the individual. If he or she or if the company has an overseas listing in those countries, it would be very wise to check into those countries' public databases to see if they pop up on any of these search terms. Now that we've discussed what happens in an IDD investigation, let's talk about what information is gained or can be gained from such a research. Let's also address what companies can do with the information they obtained. I've always told clients that information is useless unless it's actionable. So let's understand a little bit about how this information can be used. Let's talk also about how information can be used to address corruption or reputational risk in China, and then how achieving IDD objectives can avert liability and reputational damage. First, it's important for companies planning to enter China, whether by acquisition or by JV agreement, as well as those with existing operations in China, to understand what risks are posed by their business integrity issues. These issues may impact deal conditions, valuation, or operations after the sale. They may result in unforeseen costs, and from an M&C perspective, they present the risk of broad reputational damage, both in China and overseas. So to resolve these problems before they begin, we feel that an IDD investigation allows us to discover information that would indicate whether the client and their brands are subject to any of these risks by some person or entity, involvement in a prospective or pending transaction, or already engaged in a business with the client. You can see that on this slide there are multiple areas at all positions within the deal cycle where IDD can play a valuable role to understanding the impact of the deal. Even from the valuation, which would be in the early stage, to the later stage before something is signed, or even it's better to understand your business partner before pre-acquisition. But as you can see, damage can be done post-acquisition, which would damage the brand and also the parent company internationally, which is something that needs to be considered as well. I've listed here a few things to cover information that I've received feedback and I've heard in the market, things that firms would like to know regarding a prospective management team. I'm not sure if the font there is large enough to read, but I'll just cover a few points for you to understand and appreciate some of the diverse but yet still complete areas that need to be researched when doing an integrity due diligence check. Obviously, it's very important to understand the business history of the organization or your potential business partner, their track record, how they've negotiated, and what are the reputations of the principals and management team. In many cases, we will be hired to do a check not only on the organization, but also maybe 3 or 4 members of the management team as well, as they may have different dealings in organizations that could impact the reputation and future direction of the organization. We're looking at red flags, which I'll explain in the next slide specifically. We're looking at involvement in corruption, bribery, fraud, or any other crime to help them understand, the Western business partner understand where this organization stands here in China. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the track record is critical. how they managed and held similar ventures and business relationships to that proposed. So seeing what their history looks like in China when it comes to acquisitions or business partnerships with Western companies, and then how they managed it. Political relationships, this is also something very keen to the top of mind for local management here and for the management back home. Understanding if they have political support. Clearly this may not be able to be revealed, but it's important to make efforts to try and to understand the relationship mapping that takes place between some of the individuals that you may be going into business with in China. Leading to that will be the hidden influencers over a company, such as hidden shareholders or those behind the scenes that could impact or influence the financial decisions or reputational decisions of the organization. And then conflicts of interest. Many cases that I've seen here in China, this has been a very prevalent issue where employees or management will be working for another organization where it's a clear conflict of interest to the current organization that they're leading, or hiring those, as I mentioned, such as the JP Morgan, the Friends and Family, or Sons and Daughters program is something that's also very prevalent here in China. Undisclosed business interests, something that's also been identified here too. It's very clear and summarized very succinctly there at the bottom about how the findings of integrity due diligence, in many cases, they can actually give you confirmation, as I'll explain in one of the case studies later, and that it's nice to have this third-party check to give you confirmation. It helps move forward the deal. It also can give you evidence or information to reconsider or even stop a deal. So it's a nice added touch to the existing due diligence that I'm sure every organization already is doing in China, but this is something that is coming from the third party and is very objective in that nature. Now, I mentioned a little bit about red flags in the previous slide. These are 5 here that I think definitely, if your organization is planning to enter into a relationship or have a business partner in China, certainly these areas such as lack of integrity that you can be clear about if you were go and just do a simple public record search on some of the issues in the previous slide that I've addressed about the individual or company. How did they manage it? So if there are integrity issues that you could identify. Corruption issues, clearly a red flag here. Asset misappropriation, something that is definitely worth considering as well. And then manipulation of financial results in the accounting world combined with forensic services. Forensic accounting is definitely a very active sector here in China in a sense that this is an area where it can be easily manipulated and very sophisticated fraudsters do exist. So looking at fraud and looking at areas within the fraud schemes. I've listed here several issues that we could discover through integrity due diligence, and I think it's very important to understand each of them because these are key risk issues that companies are facing that will have both financial and reputational impacts on the organization. So certainly one issue would be misrepresentation or omissions of information. Reporting errors could indicate an intention to hide something criminal or unethical practices, so it's important to understand this very clearly. Integrity or stability of current government, so sudden changes could result in the renunciation of agreements or the solicitation of bribes. One of my colleagues had a client who has an acquired business, had an agreement with the local government for certain subsidies of a fixed period for several years. Unfortunately, the local government was turned out and the new leaders were installed. The new government revoked without consideration the subsidies awarded to the client's business by the preceding government. So it's very important to have a risk, and this is a clear risk issue. It's important to understand the stability of the current organization or the current government before you go into a province or a second or third tier city in that respect. Certainly possible changes in legislation or with local regulatory authorities can impact operations. Laws can be made retroactive in China. This is one issue that's a reality of doing business here and a key risk of that as well. Direct or indirect foreign government ownerships. This clearly reduces efficiency, promotes corruption, and inhibit market entry by others. Definitely a risk issue. Attitude of key authorities to foreign investors. So foreign entities may encounter an imbalanced playing field on market entry simply because they're not a local company is a risk. A few others I'd like to cover on this slide is the macro risks inherent in a region or a specific sector. There's a high concentration with heavy reliance on one supplier or customer, overbalancing your supply chain with a single customer or supplier. And this can also, all of these risks and a few others that I'll name in a minute can be fleshed out through an IDD search, which makes it very beneficial to have a professional approach done when doing checks on potential partners. I mentioned conflict of interest earlier. We've had cases where employees have worked for both buyers and sellers, didn't fully disclose this relationship. I've had employees that appointed family members outside to be a distributor, even though it was at a higher cost and it was not a competitive bidding process. We have business affiliations or known associations, so interconnections among individuals do offer opportunities for collusion. We see collusion in a big part here in China. Political links or relationships with government officials, as I mentioned, definitely more of an issue when you get outside of the larger cities. Undue influence offers opportunities for corruption and a barrier of entries for many others who are trying to take the ethical high road. A couple more to highlight here: current or past criminal, legal, regulatory problems. Patterns of behavior often indicate risk going forward. So if the individual has a track record in the past of activities that were not deemed in line with your company culture, you might consider or reconsider doing business with him or her just to protect your brand and your name here in China. And then finally, the reputation and risk profile of a target company and the key principles. Through IDD, we're able to discover reputational issues. Understanding the risk profile is a core asset. It's something that you're paying for. So before I go on to case studies, any questions, Simon?
I'm just curious about the political links and with government officials within emerging markets and markets like China. That's an important element of coming here and being successful and engaging with the local, the national, the local level with government officials. Some people might say that partners that have strong links with government would be a positive thing in terms of their ability to help you win business in China. Can you give us some examples of where that moves from being a positive relationship that's going to help you win business in China through to a high-risk relationship that you need to take action? What actions can you take?
So I think in the short answer is definitely if the relationship goes from a public to a private relationship, where you're in a meeting and then someone calls you aside and says, let's have a talk or let's have a one-on-one dinner, and then the relationship goes into more personal discussion rather than business. One thing that is actually helping China, on my personal observation, is the anti-corruption campaign that's taking place in China over the last several years. This is raising the bar for a lot of Chinese companies and helping them understand that if they want to play on the world stage, which many aspire to do, it's very critical to adhere to the rules and regulations that are being expected in foreign countries. So this anti-corruption campaign actually plays in nicely to the areas such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the UK anti-bribery law. And we're seeing a lot of Chinese companies actually understand and become more responsible in that respect. So I've seen a very good uptick in ethical responsibility among the relationships here, but it doesn't mean that you should discount and assume things with your Chinese partner. Like in any developing country, there are temptations to take shortcuts, or there are temptations to move things a little bit faster than they should along the process of negotiations. So it's very important that you do maintain a very, and I would say in a professional sense, a very public relationship with your business partner, so nothing could be misunderstood or misappropriated. And then also make sure that you have everything documented in the right places. So I think documentation is very critical as well, so that when there's a perhaps leadership change or a management change, there's a protocol that can be followed. I've seen cases where the executives had changed within the organization, so that the counterpart saw that as an opportunity to be more advantageous for things that would work in his direction. So documentation is very critical, along with making sure that you have a very robust and public relationship in that sense.
Right, and to document it and make it clear and overt is a real test of their willingness to work in a professional, international way.
Absolutely.
You'll hear about business in China, business culture in China. Maybe it's blurred between professional and personal, and maybe they'll talk about their old friend by which they do business with, and that can be a little bit confusing. But what you're saying is that actually it's right from a business perspective to keep everything above board, everything clear, everything documented. And in fact, with the anti-corruption campaign, that's actually where China wants to go. Is that correct?
That's right, and that's my observation as well in the market too. I've seen in many cases, I've seen many cases that the companies are basically being held accountable for how they're working and how they're doing business, because they want to have a business relationship with that Western company. So it's an opportune time for that organization to say, okay, we've done the IDD check, we've done the search, and we've got a couple of questions we'd like for you to answer. So this can be certainly, and I'll talk in the case studies a bit about how they're managed, but in my experience, the results from an IDD check don't necessarily mean that it's a deal breaker. It actually is an opportune time for the company, when something is identified, to come clean and to talk about the relationship and to talk about the questionable situation that's been discovered. And then, as I mentioned, they do want to have business relationships with their Western counterparts, so it's in their best interest to comply.
Absolutely, and as firms go global, they will need to be working across these standards, and so it's even more incentive these days to working that way. Let's go to the case studies perhaps and take a little look at how you've worked with particular firms.
Absolutely. Okay. So today I've prepared three, and we'll see how they come along. And then feel free to ask any questions if you'd like. We do have that availability here during the live webinar. The first case study here is a North American client that's worked here in China in the global sourcing and distribution industry. As a quick background to this case, the subject was a potential supplier for a key sourcing product of the client. The client staff visited their facilities. They noticed that they had production idle. This obviously is a red flag, because if they're promising to deliver X amount of widgets by the end of the month, they certainly better have the capability and the production lines to do that. So the client naturally was concerned about their ability for production capacity for this product. What we did with IDD, and as I mentioned earlier, it can uncover multiple angles and multiple areas that can help you make decisions. It's certainly not the final decision maker, but it aids in your decision. IDD can uncover the actual business operations through site visits and inquiries. And this is nothing that's illegal. This is nothing that's out of the laws and regulations of the operation in China. Basically, doing the discrete site visit to the registered and operations address is something as simple as just standing outside and looking at the number of people that have walked in. If you see 5 people walking in over the course of the day, when the client or the potential business partner is saying that they have a staff of 5,000, then you have an integrity issue. And we've come across issues where something as simple as just standing across the street and observing the number of people that have walked in can help understand the actual capacity capability of the organization. So we also undertook focus field inquiries to understand the operations, to make sure that there was nothing going on at a different location or a third party or a third location, as well as to get more information on the client's concerns about their continued production capacity. So from this, we were able to gain insight into the subject's reputation. As I mentioned, in countries like China or other developing countries, the reputation of an organization is absolutely critical. And whether it's been involved in any civil litigations or disputes before going into further negotiations with this company. So through IDD, the result clearly laid out here at the bottom of the slide, it was confirmed that this potential partner indeed had normal operations, had sufficient capacity and capital flow to reach the production that was expected from them. So the supplier was selected and the client arranged the orders according to plan. This is a good example of how IDD can confirm information or help alleviate any doubts that the business partner from the West may have by sitting in his office in London or someplace not in China. If you're not here, it's very difficult to really assess the true operational capacity and capability of an organization by simply looking at their website or having a couple conference calls. So having someone on the ground in China can help as simple as just going to that location, observing for a couple of days or a week to understand what's taking place there, making a few phone calls and understanding the actual operational capacity is great confirmation. So that's one example that I'd like to share. Any thoughts on that, Simon?
Yeah, I'm curious as to if there are situations where secondary research is okay, or would you always recommend hands-on research, maybe in terms of observations, or making some calls to validate that data? Are there specific situations or sizes of deals where secondary alone is okay, or would you always recommend validating the data with more hands-on type of services?
Right. That's a good question. And in some cases, the public records research is sufficient. We have been hired by clients that have said, we're good friends with this organization. We've worked with them. They've been a supplier for 10 years. We know them quite well. We just need a confirmation to keep headquarters happy, or to keep headquarters satisfied with the continued relationship. So they don't need a deep dive, full-blown investigation into the organization. They're just seeking confirmation. And that's something that IDD can add value on as well. However, when you're looking at the reputation of an organization, it's very difficult to do sitting behind the desk and looking at their website. Naturally, like anyone here on this webinar will confirm, when you're preparing and developing and designing a website, you want to make it as attractive to the potential client as possible. So there are areas that could lead or could be tempting to make the company sound grandiose, or make the company sound or read as a very unique partner to have in China, when in fact, if you make a few phone calls or go to their site and see, you don't know how that website was designed or how accurate it is. So in many cases, you also need boots on the ground, as we say, and you need that level 2 check to understand reputational issues.
Absolutely, and you can have situations where work is done in different locations around China. So and unless you have boots on the ground, and that physical check, you can't really know for sure what's happening. And it's reassuring for the China teams, but I think it's also good for the UK headquarters or the international headquarters to have that objective view as well.
Right, absolutely. Okay, let's take a second case study and take a look at this. Moving over to Europe, we have a European client in the financial industry hired us, and the background to this case was the client was hired. The client hired us to take a deep dive look into a potential business partner in China. This is the common opening line. We have a potential business partner we need you to look into, and to identify the background of its key principles. Why the key principles? Because the client told us that they actually had changed their shareholding structure a lot, and there was inconsistency in the leadership at the top. And as we all know, that when you have change in leadership at the top, you also have perhaps cultural changes or strategic changes that could impact not only the financials, but also impact the morale of the teams that are below them. So there were concerns regarding profitability of the organization because management was changing frequently. The subject company was in the private sector, so one of the key factors to understand its success or failure, or even the revenue, is to the number of students that they can attract into their schools. So the reputation of the company, the key principles, as I mentioned, reputation has come back again. It's a very critical area to understand. Would have great influence on its student requirement. And so they're looking to understand how they're regarded in the local market here in China. And I'm not talking about a place like Shanghai or Beijing where the standard may be a bit higher than the tier 3 or tier 4 cities. Typically, these types of relationships, or the calls are coming for IDD, is not necessarily for the clients or potential targets here in the Tier 1 cities. So in addition, regulatory policy, restriction towards private education, this was also important, and this is where the level 1 or the public records information would come in handy, because all that is public information, but sitting over in Europe, you may not have access to that, especially in the local language, to understand and see how that interprets into your strategies. So what did we do? We took different ways of discrete investigations to understand the company's current operations and the number of students, as well as its financial status. Once again, I can remind everyone that this was all within the legal limits and laws. It's just a matter of counting how many students are in the room, which you can't do from Belgium or from Italy. So you do something as simple as that, but it makes such a large impact on how you're directing your investments. The results actually came out quite good, and these key factors that influence profitability of the company, such as number of students, such as consistency in the management, turned out to be good in the end, and the findings of our research. So it was located that the company had a very good relationship with public universities to secure long-term and stable development. At that point, the client was ready to proceed with this company and make a decision to engage the potential business partner. So this again is another example of how IDD can come through to support and confirm information. It's nice to have that information that you've got internally, but if you've got a third-party professional firm on the ground in the local language collecting it for you, it's actually that extra sense of confirmation that headquarters appreciates, and in this operating environment, especially in a place like China, they're expecting it. So this is a good example of how IDD can confirm details.
Yes, I mean, education is a very interesting sector. I mean, CBBC has investors approaching it in terms of investing with UK education firms. Also, UK education organizations in the UK are approached directly by Chinese organizations. Some of them are pure investors. Some of them are actually have made their business in property, but are diversifying into education, or made their money in finance and are diversifying in education. Many of them in second and third tier cities. Are there any red flags particularly that you feel that companies need to be aware of in the second and third tier cities, and what advice do you give to companies that are being approached by Chinese investors to build an educational establishment in China?
Good, very good question. I'd like to take a step back and answer first about the organizations that we've seen in China that do operate in multiple industries and sectors. It's very important, especially in a case like this, that you have a clear peace of mind of their leadership. If you have someone that's been in the manufacturing industry, specifically within automotive parts supplies for the last 20 years, and suddenly he's the next real estate guru in Guangzhou, then it might be a challenge for you to appreciate their reputation and do business with them as a real estate expert. So reputational issues are very critical with those organizations that claim a host of industry expertise, a host of geographic knowledge, and areas that could position them as good business partners and sound business leaders, when in fact they're just doing it and being driven by profitability measures as opposed to actual real expertise. I think one area in the West is that we're looking at the background of the leaders. I think that's very important to appreciate, to know that they have this level and they can be sustainable in the organization and not swap out if a deal goes bad or something like that takes place. The other part of your question was regarding the Tier 2, Tier 3 cities. Definitely those areas, more than any other area in China, is very important to put people out there and to look at how the organizations are managed. As we all know, China is indeed a very diverse country when it comes to provincial rules, regulations, and management practices. The way you're doing business in northern China is definitely not the way you're doing business in southern China. There are certain, obviously Beijing is calling the shots, but they do have provincial and even city area, village regulations that are unique to themselves. So understanding the local environment is critical. And that's why it's important to have a a partner who understands the local environment and knowledge.
Absolutely. So even if you've been successful in Hong Kong and you go across the way to Shenzhen or Guangzhou or further up towards the north and the east, it's a completely different ballgame. Yes. and requires another set of eyes to understand how things can progress. Good. Okay.
All right. So the last case study that I'd like to share with everyone is back to North America. I have a client in the chemical industry. This one's a little bit more interesting and actually helped avert an issue for the client in a sense that we were able to provide actionable information. As I mentioned earlier, information is not that useful unless it's actionable. So this is a great opportunity for me to share a case study where it made a difference in the client's decision-making process. Whistleblowers. This is a topic that gets a lot of attention these days, and certainly part of our compliance program advisory support areas to establish programs, whistleblower hotlines, areas that can be used to help mitigate risk. And so the client received an anonymous whistleblower letter, and there was conflict of interest. This is another issue that I've mentioned that seems to repeat itself in doing business here, between one of its senior managers and a distributor of the client. It was alleged, or in the letter it was discussed, that the subject employee was the actual controller of the distributor. So we have someone who's helping another person out who may or may not be a relative, may or may not be a high school classmate, but in any case, decisions were made more on personal bias than they were on actual business dealings. And they utilized the position to facilitate business for the distributor, something that's actually quite a common scheme here. The subject employee, the client hired us, and they were suspicious of one of their employees. They were alleged to ask for bribes for some distributors publicly, and then they terminated contracts with distributors who refused to do so. So this is an area where it's actually quite a diverse request, and it's more than people. We may actually have communications that can be revealed or exposed to prove as evidence for this allegation. I mean, obviously, anonymous tips, they can be as a result of disgruntled employees. Competitors can bring them in just to shake up the organization and cause havoc on their business dealings. But in many cases, in all cases, I think it's very critical that a thorough review and investigation does confirm or deny such allegations. So it's nothing you take lightly, especially in an environment where you're working with your reputation at stake. So IDD is one element of the business. You can combine it with other investigation or forensic practices such as data analytics, e-discovery, to identify high-risk individuals as well as information about related knowledge. Now, the investigation results, as you can see here, actually confirm the allegations that were brought in through the whistleblower letter. The subject employee has set up the company under his mother-in-law's name, which we found out through relationship mapping here in the integrity due diligence approach, and also before changing the shareholders to his friends. So he was building his, we can say his little circle of friendships here, and basically this was enough information for the client to fire the employee. We were able to bring enough evidence that was not based on opinion, but based on facts, and it was enough information to let the employee go and get the company back on track towards an ethical and moral way. So this is a third example of integrity due diligence and the contribution that it can make to actually helping companies weed out those employees who are causing difficulty to the bottom line, and also can make the company more accountable for Western standards when they're in a position to do business with Western companies.
I think it's really really interesting in terms of the actionable information that you talk about. I think it's important not just to do the research, but to help companies make decisions. Clearly, that's something that you do at Grant Thornton. Before I ask this next question, what I'll do is I'll throw it out to people listening on the webinar. If you do want to ask a question, we've got a couple of moments left, so please do feel free to, if you've got a question in your mind, just put it in the box and send it over to us here in Shanghai. We'll be happy to pick it up. But I am interested in the actions that companies can take, because it is about decision making, and this is difficult. In an emerging market, manipulation of financial records, some elements of corruption. If you look at what's happened over the past 10, 15 years in certain industries, I would guess, correct me if I'm wrong, that will have happened in an emerging market. So what advice do you give to international companies in terms of saying, when is it a deal breaker? When is it stop? And in what areas can you mitigate the risk? And what actions can you take? Do you find that each individual company has their own risk assessment and appetite for risk? Or do you think, in your experience, that there is a standard set of criteria that companies can apply to the way that they assess and mitigate risk?
Yes, that's a great question, and can be answered in many ways.
Yeah.
I think the short answer is yes, companies, depending on the industry, depending on the location, and location I mean North America, Europe, Africa, Australia, they all have their ethical compass, and they all have their convictions when it comes to risk tolerance. How it's defined may be different among the leaders, and as I mentioned earlier, it's very important to make sure that you are in an organization where the leadership does have a very strong focus on risk management, especially in a place in China where the temptations are great. I think one thing that we have identified in the past, and one thing that we've been able to look at, is how have they handled situations that have come into question in the past. And you can kind of evaluate how they managed it in the past to check a track record to see how they might handle it coming up again in the next several opportunities to prove that. So if you're looking at their risk appetite, definitely take a look back at how they've managed it before. You want to be leery of organizations that have just come onto the scene in China and don't have a track record or don't have a history of doing business within the industry. And you also want to be leery of organizations that are in this industry for a short time and are making a splash. Doesn't mean you close the deal. It doesn't mean it's a deal breaker, but it's an opportunity to present your findings to the company and to say, let's talk about this a little bit. And I would encourage everyone to get on a plane and fly out to China and meet these individuals face to face, rather than investing or putting them on your supply chain list. So that's something, and it seems that there's a question that's come in, so I'd like to answer that if I may. The question is, could IDD create further risk to Western businesses, such as negatively impacting relationships with government? That's actually a very commonly asked question, and I've seen that, and this is answered in a very simple way. We being those in the professional services industry, are held accountable. We don't offer a product to the market. We offer our reputation. That's all we have. And basically, we are in the business of abiding by the laws of the local government. So what we're doing is presenting information to organizations within the realms of the legal limitations. So in that case, I don't think that this is an issue of further risk, at least in my own experience. We do bring this out as information to be an enabler of information, or to give them an extra added touch of information, but we simply don't say you have to base your investment decisions on our report. We are one piece of the puzzle. There is another question that's come in, and thank you for this question. How do you handle telling your potential partner that you're undertaking integrity due diligence on them? Do you do it covertly, or are you open about it? In my experience, as I mentioned earlier in the discussion within the webinar here, we are very open about discussing with them, because they want to know, they want to, in the cases that we're very open about, they want to have this business relationship. So basically, we inform or advise the client to tell them that this is part of the onboarding process. This is a step that we take, and is a Western requirement to do and collect information as part of the onboarding process, whether it's a supplier or whether it's a vendor or something like that. So in many cases, if it's a potential partner and the Western company is not in a position to face them directly for these types of information yet, to get this type of information yet, it's actually a very nice approach that we take. They don't know, but we're not collecting anything that's illegal, so it's public information, or it's collecting information that wouldn't impact their bottom line in their business. So we have that. I think that answers that question. Another question that just come in, we've got a couple minutes here, so let me answer this question as well. Does this not happen between Chinese businesses? Well, it's a tough question to answer, to be honest with you. The operations of Chinese businesses to Chinese businesses, typically we're not involved. Those who are doing due diligence or background checks typically are not hired by Chinese companies. The majority, and I would say the large majority of our clientele base and the client base of all of those in the industry here in China are the Western companies that want to know their Chinese business partners. Now, if you have an organization that's Chinese-based and they want to do background checks on a potential acquisition target here in China, I would say that it's important in their best interest to work with them, so putting all the information out front. And then you can do a check to confirm or corroborate that information. And if there's a discrepancy in that, then you can go and talk to them about it.
Interesting. I think in terms of the international firms that we work with, working with Chinese partners, there's a new trend as Chinese firms go global, in that we see UK companies working with Chinese firms in third country markets in Africa and other parts of the world. Right. I would expect that makes the complexity ever deeper.
It does.
And more difficult to really understand how the relationships fit together in different emerging markets. Is that something that Grant Thornton approaches and works on?
Yes, I think that's one of the benefits of being a part of a global organization with a presence in 130 plus countries. I'm leading the integrity due diligence in Shanghai for clients here, but I have counterparts in more than 40 countries around the world in the major markets or regions that can actually work with me and have the similar backgrounds that I have. So yes, being a part of a global organization does help mitigate a lot of the issues. We have a Chinese company that's investing in Indonesia. I pick up the phone, I call my colleague in Jakarta, and then we can actually serve the client in a very effective way. So that's good.
This is an increasing trend that we're seeing in terms of the network of relationships between international firms and Chinese firms and Chinese firms which are going global. And I think that having that common base of integrity and having an organization come in and talk about that with the different stakeholders is useful for the deal and useful for going forward.
Yep, I agree.
Good. Well, I think we're approaching the limit of time. We've talked about the types of risk and the increased risk of working in emerging markets and how it's mitigated. We've talked about the different types of research and understanding what partner organizations do, but critically how they manage it. How do they manage that problem? How do they work on that? We've talked about secondary research, but also boots on the ground that can give you the information to take actionable types of activities that can protect your business and help you do the deal and help you push your business forward here in China and both internationally. So I'd like to thank Tim from Grant Thornton for coming and sharing the time and sharing his insights with us today. I'd like to thank everybody who took part in the webinar. I wish you all a great day, and I look forward to seeing everybody and listening to everybody at the next CBBC webinar. Thanks for your time. Goodbye for now.